Welcome to Cybercast, decoding today's cyber issues. I'm Alexander Bolova, production lead at GovCIO Media and Research. At yesterday's CyberScape Insider Threats event, Deputy Editor Kate Macri sat down with Anjana Rajan, Assistant National Cyber Director for Technology Security at the White House, to discuss the new National Cybersecurity Strategy released that morning. Rajan explained how the Russia-Ukraine war and high-profile software security incidents such as Log4Shell and SolarWinds led to the creation of this new strategy. You can watch this fireside chat and other event panels on our website, govciomedia.com. Let's take a listen to their conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Macri, Deputy Editor at GovCIO Media and Research, and I'll be moderating our closing fireside chat today with Anjana Rajan, who is the Assistant National Cyber Director for Technology Security at the White House. So Anjana brings a wealth of experience and expertise from private industry and the public policy arena. So we're going to dive into the nitty-gritty of how federal agencies and their industry partners can take cybersecurity policies and executive orders and memos and turn that into meaningful action. So I'm sure many of you in this room are aware the White House released its National Cybersecurity Strategy this morning. So we're going to wrap up today's event with a discussion on the state of cybersecurity over the last year and the evolving cybersecurity priorities that have informed the creation of this new strategy. So to start off our conversation, last week marked the one-year anniversary of Russia invading Ukraine. What has been the role of cybersecurity in modern warfare over the last year and its impact?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be here. I think in the past year, since Russia's very brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, I think three things have become incredibly clear. I think first and foremost that the people of Ukraine are resilient and brave and in an unmatched way. And I think that around the world, people are looking at Ukrainians with awe and admiration, and that their fight is not just for their own country, but for democracy around the world. I think number two is that the United States government stands unequivocally with Ukraine. The president was in Kyiv last week, showing that we will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. And I think number three is that the conflict in Ukraine has fundamentally transformed the cybersecurity threat landscape. And I think there's a few themes that I think are clear to me that will inform where we need to go next. I think number one, that the arena for this war exists in cyberspace, and that our adversaries will choose cyberspace to engage in offensive attacks, and that means our critical infrastructure needs to be resilient and defensible for the long term. The day before the war started, we saw that Russia led a cyber attack against Viasat, which meant that Ukrainians' satellite broadband network was temporarily dismantled, making it difficult for the playing field to be leveled. And I think that's where we're going to be seeing a lot of new strategies evolving. And so as we think about our role as technologists in the cyber ecosystem, understanding how do you build resilient systems will become even more mission critical. I think number two is the way that information operations is being part of the cyber landscape. We know that information operations is often used to influence the global perception of the war. And this is not new, right? We know that this has been a tactic long before the digital era. But I think what we need to be mindful of is how is emerging technology going to accelerate the rate and disruption of this causes. And in particular, what keeps me up at night is the rise of generative AI and the underpinnings of the geopolitical ecosystem that will make information warfare faster, more precise, and more dangerous. And I think third is just the role of the private sector. I think it's very clear that both in the past year and in the future to come, the role of the private sector is mission critical, and that the role of government and private sector partnership becomes increasingly important.
Yeah. So has open source software played a role in all of this?
Absolutely. And this is a good way to kind of tie it to the National Cybersecurity Strategy, where we talk about securing the foundation of the internet. I think to talk about open source, we have to first start with the ethos of the open source ecosystem. And kind of fundamentally, it's quite a beautiful concept that the ideas of one combined with the ideas of other makes us greater as a whole. And that is like a fundamentally democratic concept. And so we're watching that actually happen in real time in Ukraine. I think we're seeing on the open source software side, we're seeing the open source community come together and build, scalable cryptographic libraries that can help defend against, Russian cyber warfare. We're also seeing it on the data side, and much has been written about the OSINT community's analysis and changing the way the intelligence game is being played. And we're seeing things like open source satellite imagery and geolocation data becoming mission critical in the way the war is fought.
Yeah. So before you came to government, you were a CTO in the tech industry and humanitarian sector and had to address the Log4Shell software vulnerability. So how do those experiences inform your approach to cybersecurity from a public policy perspective?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a unusual creature in the White House. I'm a cryptographer and engineer by background. And I think what is been interesting is that the world of engineering and the world of policy are actually quite similar because, both require understanding how complex systems work. And so I think there's actually more synergy than I may have guessed. Before I came to the White House, one of the jokes we have in our office is that, nobody cares about cybersecurity outside of cybersecurity professionals. And if that is true, then we need to actively change that because cybersecurity absolutely affects everybody. And before I came to the White House, I was the CTO of the largest anti-human trafficking NGO in the United States. One of the programs that we ran was operating a government-funded crisis hotline, 24/7, 365, emergency service response infrastructure that responded to millions of calls from victims and survivors who were in urgent and dangerous crisis. We're talking about infrastructure that needed to be resilient, reliable, and defensible. And in 2021, when Log4Shell happened, my team and I, like many of your teams, had to pull our eyes off the mission. And I remember thinking, in that moment, how many lives are we neglecting right now because of a cybersecurity issue that is caused by an obscure open source logging, piece of code about logging that perhaps many of us weren't even aware were in our ecosystem? How much trust have we broken with survivors and victims who are depending on us to keep their data safe? And how can we fully know that we've actually secured our ecosystem when we can't even see the bottom of the ocean and really see the edges of this very complex network? And I think for looking at Log4Shell, I think it was just a reminder that it is not just cyber companies or tech infrastructure companies that need to care about it. It was the thoughts that I was thinking about were the thoughts of every CTO of every major institution around the world. And it made it very clear that this was a kind of whole of ecosystem sense of urgency. And so when I think about how do I bring that lived experience to the policy space, I think it's making sure that, the devil's in the details, that policy as rhetoric is not good enough, that we need to think about how do we actually implement these solutions when you're actually sitting, holding the pen or have, fingers on the keyboard. And I think it's really important for the CTO role in particular to be able to translate both, because if that policy doesn't make sense in implementation, it's not good policy. And I think that's really something I think makes kind of an engineering mindset in the policy sector really valuable, because it helps drives home implementation of a lot of these ideas that we can all agree on.
Yeah. So as a follow-up to that, what are some good policy solutions to securing open source software, especially since everyone is using it?
Yeah. In the wake of Log4Shell, our former and inaugural National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis, called upon the interagency to come together and really understand what were the root causes of the risks in this ecosystem. And so it was the usual suspects across the interagency coming together. And essentially what we formed was what we call now the Open Source Software Security Initiative, or OS3I, which I now co-lead. And the group essentially identified 4 main drivers of risk that perhaps will not be a surprise to this room. I think number one is that the motivations and incentives for software developers to prioritize cybersecurity are opaque at best. And we need to think about what are the motivations when open source developers are building tools and solutions. Number two, the infrastructure that is distributing open source software, it's hard for them to actually enforce security measures. It is also hard to have good data that helps understand where the vulnerabilities are. And those are, I'll pause there because I think those are things that the interagency has been working on for a very long time to address. I think many of you here are very familiar with the concept of S-bombs and the CVE managed by MITRE. These are things that I think industry and government have been talking about for a while. But I think the fourth finding that I thought was particularly interesting was that much of the vulnerabilities in the open source ecosystem stem from issues of memory unsafety. And I think that was something that we had heard of much in the engineering community, but hadn't actually come through into the policy world for quite some time.
Yeah. For those in the audience who might not understand what memory unsafety is, could you explain what that is in respect to open source?
Sure. So the concept of memory safety essentially describes kind of an underlying property of a programming language, regardless of whether it's proprietary or open source. And it really means that in that language, a developer can introduce vulnerabilities and bugs that pertain to the way memory is stored, both spatially and temporally. So what I'm basically saying is there are a few languages that right now that are prominent that are what we consider memory unsafe, and those are C and C++ mostly. And there are many different types of bugs that come out of memory unsafety issue, but I'll explain just one example. So let's say that I have a list of 10 items, and then I write a program that calls upon the 11th item in the list, right? Presumably, we assume that the program would return an error because there isn't an 11th item. In a memory unsafe language, that error check doesn't happen by default. And what ends up happening is it will return the value of whatever is stored in memory. So when you think about the cybersecurity implications of that, it's actually quite catastrophic. It means that I could see data that I shouldn't see. It means I could write data that I shouldn't write. It means I can access data that was already deleted. And so when you now apply this not to just a list of 10 items, you're now talking about the entire digital ecosystem of our US government. That becomes a very easy to exploit vulnerability for an adversary. Now, can you actually now manually correct this in memory unsafe languages and do that? Sure, but it's not the most elegant engineering, and it certainly creates room for missing something, so that if you just have one thing that you miss, it's all the adversary needs. And so when we talk about memory safe languages being kind of a great kind of nexus of good engineering meets good cybersecurity policy, this felt really interesting to me, at least, to say, just because I talked about earlier, like, where are the points where the cybersecurity policy community and the engineering community can see eye to eye? Mm-hmm. This felt like this room. This felt like that opportunity. And specifically, what researchers have shown is that if you take a code base that is memory unsafe, that's large enough, and you migrate it to a memory safe language, you can reduce the number of vulnerabilities by up to 70%.
Wow.
Which is pretty remarkable. And so let me be very clear about what I am not saying, because I want to make sure that I'm speaking precisely. What I am not saying is that memory safety is a silver bullet. I'm not saying that if you're writing in a memory safe program, you are immune to any cybersecurity risk and you can go take a nice vacation. What I'm saying is that it's a pretty good lever to pull. And if I were back in my CTO chair and I was building out my cybersecurity roadmap, that would be where I'd be putting my best bet, because I think about how do I then recognize that my resources to implement cybersecurity are limited. Mm-hmm. And to be very candid, we need to make sure that we're spending our limited talent on solving worthy problems rather than problems that we could have prevented by design.
Right. So pivoting a little bit, what are some misconceptions about open source that you've encountered?
It's funny. I think when Log4Shell happened, I think the U.S. government understandably was very concerned about the prevalence of open source in our ecosystem, and I think there's a tendency for government to want to make it go away. And what I think we try to explain across the ecosystem is that open source is not only a secure and resilient open source ecosystem is not only a national security imperative, but also an economic prosperity imperative and a democracy and human rights imperative. You cannot build a competitive business without open source, right? If you are reinventing the wheel every single time, you will not compete globally or domestically. And so this idea of composability, this idea of A plus B is stronger than the whole is stronger than some of its parts, is how we compete economically, and protecting that is a business imperative. We talked earlier about how open source is part of the conflict in Ukraine and defending that. It's a democracy imperative. And so I think it's important to recognize that, and this is kind of the posture we take at the Office of the National Cyber Director, is that when we look at cyberspace, we start with an affirmative vision. We don't start with a fear-based approach. We start by saying, what is a potential future we want to live in, and how do we mitigate the risk and optimize the potential? Mm-hmm. And so I think the misconception is that open source is somehow unruly and unwieldy. But conversely, the message I give to my friends in the open source developer community is good engineering is good engineering is good engineering, no matter what you call yourself, whether you're a community or an institution or a company. You need to have good engineering practices. You need to have good management of your ecosystem, and that there's a discipline required to make sure that if you're building open source software, you're doing it and making decisions that are secure. And so a lot of what we're trying to do with the Open Source Software Security Initiative is engage with the ecosystem and explain that we all win when this thing is secure, and that we all have a part to play in making sure that it's resilient and secure and usable by all.
Right. So I know you have to get back to the White House. So I have one more question for you before we head out, more like a two-part question. So I'm wondering if you can give us a high-level perspective on the National Cyber Strategy that was just released and how that is perhaps helping to address the cyber problems that keep you up at night.
Yeah, I think I'll answer the second part first, which is what keeps you up at night. I think we talk about, left of boom versus right of boom. And I think in government, we're very comfortable. And in general, I think as humans, we're comfortable with right of boom because then we can see the destruction and we can rally others to care. And that is not necessarily the best world we want to live in. And I think we have to start thinking about what is the next thing around the corner and what are the patterns we're missing that we could predict. And I think specifically with open source, what's the next emerging threat in open source? Well, what are the technologies that are built on open source ecosystems? The one that comes to mind first and foremost is cryptocurrency. We talk a lot about what happened last November with FTX, and I think the conversation, rightfully so, has been around the economic fallout of this financial system. But we are not talking enough about the cybersecurity of that ecosystem, and especially recognizing, taking the learnings we saw from all these other open source catastrophes. What are the problems that are coming over there, and how are we drawing an interdisciplinary nexus between these two things? When you look at cryptocurrency, are we looking at the programming languages of smart contracts, of blockchain and all these things, and making the same through line to say, are those built on memory safe languages? Are we understanding the composability and the supply chain of that? And if we don't start thinking about that, it's not just ordinary data that's being put at risk, it's an entire financial economy that will collapse. And it's incredibly important that the cybersecurity community help the financial institution community understand how this works and how we can build this in by design. So that's, I think, one thing that keeps me up at night. I'll kind of close with talking about our strategy. This is a really exciting day for us here at ONCD and also in the Biden administration at large. I think this strategy is unique in the sense that it is the first time an office dedicated to cybersecurity is writing it, which means that it is bold and it is written by people who have been thinking about this topic for a long time. And I think we're tired but excited to finally share it with all of you. We'll be having a formal launch event in a few hours, and I don't want to upstage the National Security Advisor and National Cyber Director, so I will be careful about what I share. But what I will say is that there are kind of two big strategic shifts that we're calling for. I think first and foremost, we're saying that we need to rebalance who holds the majority of the responsibility. I think too often we are relying on the individual consumer and the small business and the independent developer and the local and state government to defend against, nation states. And that is an unfair burden we're putting on the wrong folks. And that what we need to rebalance is the players who can bear that burden, both in the public and private sector, need to do their fair share of cybersecurity. And I think that's something that when we did over 400 table reads with industry, many people agreed with. The second big shift we're calling for is how do we use market incentives to encourage us making investments in long-term security rather than short-term Band-Aids? And I think this is recognizing that, making this a voluntary, assuming that people will voluntarily focus on cybersecurity is wishful thinking, and we now need to recognize that We have to create the ecosystem and the financial incentives to understand why this is a priority. So you will hear much more from us in a few hours. We're really excited to share this with all of you, and I'm really glad that the timing of this worked out so that we could talk more fulsomely about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time,
Thank you for having me.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for a Q&A because you have to get back, but we really appreciate you taking the time to talk about strategy and the ecosystem at large and the environment that we're operating in.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Cybercast, along with GovCast and HealthCast, is a production of GovCIO Media and Research. For more podcasts and to check out the other shows, head to govciomedia.com. Watch out for new episodes released every Tuesday and Wednesday across our shows. You can follow all of them on your favorite podcast platform. And if you like what you heard, make sure to let us know by leaving a review. And if you have any topics you think we should look into, contact us at newsletter@govcio.com.